What you are seeing on the screen is Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook and one of the richest people on the planet, who at the time was in a lot of trouble. The US government authorities had called him to testify and answer very serious questions due to a recent scandal. The data of millions of users had been leaked and a company had used it to manipulate the presidential elections, which ended up putting Donald Trump in power for the first time. He tries to defend himself, but a senator asks him a question that leaves him with no way out. Mark, would you feel comfortable sharing with us the location of the hotel where you are staying? With this question, Mark evidences the problem of the limits of the right to privacy. Moreover, during this session and in many other videos, we can see that Mark behaves quite strangely, almost as if he doesn't know how to express himself or gesture like the rest of humans, which raised many suspicions about his origins. Below, I'm going to explain to you why Mark behaves like this and why you sometimes feel that your phone listens to you and how Facebook and Cambridge Analytica manipulated millions of Americans for months until they got them to vote for the candidate they wanted to put in power. Obviously, things for good old Mark didn't start out in such a perverse way. Fortunately for him, he grew up in a good family. His parents are successful professionals. His mother, Karen, studied psychiatry at Brooklyn College, and his father, Edward, dentistry. In addition, Mark has 3 sisters. His parents are aware that computers will be a key tool in the future, so they make sure that each of their children has one from a young age. They think that this will give their children a competitive advantage when they have to look for a job. The thing is that Mark, for some strange reason, turns out to be extremely adept at understanding and using computers, practically a prodigy. And computers end up becoming his passion. Now let's remember that in the 80s computers were much more expensive than they are now, and Mark's parents could afford to buy one for each son. The cheapest ones were around $2,500. Mark is obsessed with technology and programming and spends days or even months at a time working on projects that he does for fun. For now, the most ambitious projects are games for fun with his sisters or animations, but soon they will be more ambitious. Thanks to his talent and these strategies of Mark's father, his practice begins to hire more employees, which gives young Mark an idea. At the age of 11, Mark decided to apply his own knowledge to create ZuckNet, a program that allows dentists to share information instantly and families to communicate with their parents from home, since the office was connected to the home. In other words, Mark invented a form of instant messaging before programs like AOL's AIM popularized the concept, and at an age when many children are just beginning to understand decimal division. Because of this and because they can, Mark's parents enroll him in one of the most prestigious high schools in the country, Phillips Exeter Academy, where he learns French, Hebrew, Latin, and ancient Greek, wins awards in science and classical literature, and becomes captain of the fencing team. There he also meets another little genius named Adam DeAngelo, with whom he teams up to do a final project before graduation. The latter is a music player that learns your tastes and saves you the trouble of putting together playlists. He loves the project, the school graduates with honors, and Mark is accepted to Harvard for college. At that point, Microsoft approaches Mark with an offer of $2 million for Synapse, but the deal included working a few years with them, which meant postponing his entrance into Harvard. So Mark turns down the offer and instead decides to give the software away to the entire internet with his friend. In the fall of 2002, he enters Harvard, where he chooses to major in psychology and computer science, 2 majors that, combined, will give him the ability to program and, in addition, to understand human behavior, which will be key to the development of the social networks he is about to create. At Harvard, Mark befriends Eduardo Saberin, a brilliant business student. The son of a wealthy Brazilian businessman, he is the kind of Harvard student who shows up to class in a suit and his Bible is "Rich Dad, Poor Dad." He looks for any opportunity to make a good deal. As Mark begins his second year at Harvard, he realizes that many choose their classes based on whether a friend, boy or girl, will be in the same class, which causes chaos when spots open up and the halls are full of students checking the lists over and over again. To solve it, Mark creates CourseMatch, a website that shows in real time how many students have enrolled in each class. And this is where the movie The Social Network begins, which is heavily inspired by the book The Accidental Billionaires, which tells the story of the creation of Facebook from Eduardo Saverin's perspective, which will be important because Mark and Eduardo ended very badly. We see that Mark is with a girl on a date that will be the first piece of a domino that will change the world. The important thing is that on the date Mark and the girl get into an argument. The fight escalates to such an extent that the girl prefers to leave the coffee shop and leave Mark alone. With no choice, the guy runs all over the university until he gets to his room, where he takes his computer, opens a beer, and writes bitterly about his date's girl on his LiveJournal blog, a website that existed before, something like the most primitive version of a social network. Already drunk, Mark starts looking at the photo directory of the different Harvard houses while continuing to blog about how ugly most of these pictures are. Mark comes up with an idea. As a joke, he starts to create a website where the photos of different girls are compared and people can vote on which one is more attractive. The problem is that to do this, he's going to have to take all the photos he can from these school Facebooks without permission. This is a bit dangerous because the school might find out it was him and expel him, but he's still going ahead. Mark visits every single page of the dorms and circumvents the cybersecurity of the most prestigious university in the world like it's nothing. Eduardo Saberin comes to visit after seeing Mark's first post about the girl at the bar he argued with, as he assumes his friend needs help. And Mark needs him, but not for emotional support, but to give him a line of code Eduardo wrote some time ago to be able to rank chess players by skill, but wants to modify it to rank photos of girls voted as similarly attractive. With this, Mark finishes his site, which he names facemash.com. Mark then mails it to a couple of people and they mail it to more people, but things quickly get out of hand. The site causes so much interest that it begins to be shared among members of the entire university. Some laugh, others are outraged, but no one can stop voting and interacting with the page. In just a few hours, that same night, the page ends up going viral on the Harvard network, which ends up collapsing the servers, leaving Mark and his friends shocked. The traffic achieved with a page created in a few hours managed to collapse the servers of one of the most prestigious universities in the country. Obviously, Harvard's administrative board is not amused by what has just happened, not to mention the various women's student organizations. They filed complaints of invasion of privacy. At the appropriate hearing, Mark apologizes for the outrage he caused his female classmates, but dares to demand recognition, believing that he did the school a favor by exposing security flaws in the network. In later interviews, Mark recounts that, at the time, he was so sure he was going to be expelled that his own mother went to help him pack. If he had been a lesser student, he would have been expelled after face match, but Mark is sent back to class only with a warning. Thanks to this practical joke, Mark meets 3 students on campus who will be important: Divya and identical twins Cameron and Tyler Winklevoss. He has an idea to create a social network at Harvard and thinks the drunk he threw the net at might be just the person to help them program their social network. For their part, the Winklebosses are students from a wealthy family involved in the business world. The brothers intercept Mark in the hallway. The brothers invite him to talk in a more private place and propose the idea. They want to create an exclusive social network for Harvard students called Harvard Connection, and exclusivity will be its strong point compared to other existing social networks. In addition, the brothers say it would make an excellent dating site. Mark accepts the offer, although secretly he has completely different plans. He tells them that it won't take him more than one night to program the social network, making the 3 partners believe that they have chosen the right person, and he gets to work, but not for them, but for himself. He spends days and nights working, but ignores the 3 partners. Mark dodges their calls, stalls them by mail, and excuses himself with the heavy academic load of Harvard, although in private messages he tells his friends that he himself plans to make the social network, only with better ideas and a different approach. And that is the social network that will be known as Facebook, obviously inspired by the school Facebooks that inspired him to create FaceSmash. Mark manages to register the name the Facebook with $1,000 given to him by Eduardo Saberin in exchange for 30% of the company and the position of chief financial officer. As the days go by, Mark becomes more and more obsessed with the idea until it occupies his entire brain and demands, in exchange for his collaboration, unwavering concentration and all the energy he can squeeze out of his body, resulting in the site being almost ready in a few weeks. But something is missing. The problem is that Mark doesn't know what. One day, Mark's roommate Dustin asks him about a girl who teaches one of his classes. Specifically, he wants to know if she has a boyfriend. Mark, half asleep, is about to sarcastically reply that people don't walk around with a huge sign that says, "single." But the bombshell that just exploded in his mind interrupts him. In a classic eureka moment, Mark heads to his bedroom to add that last thing to Facebook. And this is the sentimental situation. If you're interested in meeting men or women, with this added, Facebook is set. All this in less than a month. On February 4th, 2004, Facebook loads for the first time on the internet, exclusively for people with harvard.edu emails. This news reaches the ears of the Winklevosses, who can't believe that Mark has stolen their idea and tricked them to buy time and get their social network out early. They know that things can't stay that way, so, with the help of their father's lawyers, they send a letter threatening Mark with a lawsuit if he doesn't take down Facebook and also publish an article in the university newspaper accusing him of theft. But no one ends up caring, not even Mark, because Facebook is becoming a success. In this first version of Facebook, you can only see your profile and that of others. Soon after, they implemented the news feed, but for the moment, oddly enough, there are no photos or likes. Even so, in a few days, more than 650 people register in a few days, and only 2 weeks, this figure rises to 4,000, which is amazing if we take into account that we are in 2004. But what makes Facebook so special? We have mentioned the term social network several times. But the truth is that back then this term was not even commonly used. That's because social networks before Facebook didn't feel like a place where your real-life friends were. Most things that came close to a social network allowed for anonymity. You could put absolutely anything as your name or profile picture and nothing happened. Plus, they functioned more like forums for strangers to share knowledge or talk about specific topics. MySpace, for example, allowed anonymity, and Friendster was more about meeting people in other parts of the world. Facebook, on the other hand, from the beginning forced you to register with your first and last name, because at first you had to use your Harvard email address, which gave you the assurance that you were talking to that person. In addition, the people who joined those early stages of Facebook were people you saw every day at school, which in itself fostered a more positive and rewarding community. A somewhat funny example is that on other social networks they had to hire employees to moderate posts. Since being anonymous accounts, no one cared about uploading anything because there was no personal reputation to tarnish. In contrast, on Facebook it used to be very rare for things like that to be posted because it was not anonymous, so users had to behave in a socially acceptable way. Also, context is very important. It was the early 2000s and the internet was not what it is today. There was still a lot of fear caused by the dot-com bubble. People were afraid because of movies like Matrix or Hackers, which presented the network as a dangerous place full of misfits. That's where Facebook broke with everything. It was the first platform where people felt safe to show themselves as they were. The reason? Because only those you accepted could see your profile. The privacy options were clear and flexible, and you were in full control of your information. In addition, Facebook was incredibly easy to use, which allowed people with no prior interest in technology to join. That combination of simplicity, control, and security was a key part of its explosive growth. Knowing that he has to convey a good image to the world, Mark apologizes in the paper for what happened with FaceMash and swears that privacy on Facebook is his #1 priority. But the reality is that, sadly, this is not going to be the last time we will hear a public apology from Mark, especially over privacy issues. Mark decides to start expanding. Stanford, Yale, and Columbia are other internationally prestigious universities to which he moves. To do so, he brings his 2 roommates, Chris Hughes and Dustin Moskovitz, both economics students, into the company. The former acts as the official spokesperson and the latter as the lead programmer. Dustin does not know how to program, but shows so much interest in the project that Mark teaches it to him and even offers him 5% of the company. Definitely an excellent roommate. Facebook continues to spread among students like wildfire and, By the end of May, it becomes a social network with more than 200,000 users. Nvidia and the Winkle bosses are furious. Evidently, they think Mark stole their idea for Facebook and they will not stand idly by. For his part, Mark continues to work. Eduardo invests another $18,000 in the company's account to get Facebook to move to California for the summer vacations. After this, and after studying for only 2 years, Mark leaves one of the most prestigious universities in the world. As their first offices, Mark and his team choose a house in Palo Alto, California, just a few blocks from Stanford. As expected, this house is complete chaos. They have a pool, fast food, wholesale snacks, and even a zip line in the fireplace to jump into the pool. Many students get jobs as programmers at the Facebook company, participating in hackathons organized by Mark. Palo Alto is part of a famous area known as Silicon Valley. But something raises alarms. Eduardo has decided not to accompany Mark and the team to Palo Alto. In the film, it is suggested that Eduardo took a job in New York because Facebook was not yet generating revenue and someone had to fund the company. Although it is not entirely clear whether that was his real motivation, he did go to New York. In real life, it seems that Eduardo accepted that position to focus on his own projects and founded another company related to job search. More seriously, he placed advertising on Facebook without consulting Mark. But this is not good for Facebook at all, as the whole point of the move was to get closer to the tech mecca of Silicon Valley is to find new investors, which becomes much more difficult when the CFO and one-third owner of the company seems to be more focused on his own businesses. This is where Mark meets Sean Parker, who will come to sow discord among the partners. This man became famous for having founded Napster at the age of 19, a program for sharing and downloading music completely free of charge. Although Napster died in 2002 buried by lawsuits, the company forever changed the recording industry. Sean has many contacts in Palo Alto and quickly lands one. Along with Peter Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal and one of Silicon Valley's biggest investors, Peter, convinced that Facebook is the future of social networking, invests $500,000 immediately. Mark begins to consider Sean Parker as a good candidate to be CEO, although it won't be long before he regrets that decision. This appointment does not sit well with Eduardo, so he freezes the company's accounts. Luckily, Mark's parents have a lot of money and offer him a loan of up to $85,000, while Peter's investment arrives. The bad news is that, from now on, Eduardo is a hindrance to Mark on his way to the top. Mark finds a way to kick Eduardo out of the company and does it in a way that Eduardo doesn't realize what's going on at first, and by the time he finds out, it's too late. What happened is that everything was settled by lawyers, but just like in the movie, this ended their friendship. A little later, in 2005, Mark faced 2 lawsuits, one from the Winklevoss and another from his old friend Eduardo. And to make matters worse, Sean Parker was arrested for possession of substances at a party with minors and had to resign from his position as CEO. Since a company on its way to greatness like Facebook cannot risk having ties with such controversial characters. In the end, the lawsuits ended with the Winklevoss winning $65 million in their settlement, and no one knows exactly how much Eduardo earned. As to this day, it is not public information. What we do know is that Eduardo Saverin is currently the richest Brazilian and one of the richest men on the planet, thanks to his father's business, of course. But some speculate that what he earned from the lawsuit was a gigantic amount. But despite all this money and time spent on lawsuits, nothing stops Facebook. In December 2005, less than 2 years after its launch, Facebook had 6 million registered users, and investors are lining up to shake the founder's hand. Although this is not even a fraction of what the company is about to achieve. In terms of user experience, they also continue to make progress. New features are added, such as photos and videos, making the page more visually interesting. Then the like button is added, so that users can interact more and not just comment. And further on, also added are the different reactions to express how a post makes you feel, stimuli that seem to become the new universal language of approval. In order for Facebook to continue to grow, in 2007 Facebook platform was launched, a toolkit of tools and services very useful for the development of applications within the Facebook platform, which is why there are so many games, surveys, and personality tests these days. The idea is that Facebook platform makes it easy for the next big thing to happen on Facebook, and it works. Games created within Facebook platform, such as Mafia Wars, Farmville, or Candy Crush, are massive hits. But from this point on, things get complicated, as what started out as a harmless social network will end up becoming a political weapon. We're going to get into a bit technical territory, so pay attention. Facebook's public mission is to make the world more open and connected, but its true value goes far beyond social interactions. Facebook records and histories everything we do on the platform. Every click, comment, post, or reaction becomes data that is stored, and that's really the heart of its business. But what does it do with all that information it collects day in and day out? The problem is that storing, protecting, and using the information ended up getting out of Goodmark's hands, causing the U.S. government itself to subpoena him to testify before the court of government legislators. To understand how it became such a big legal problem, we must first understand the following 3 points. First, how is it that Facebook can collect your data and social networks can know so much about you if you just put your date of birth and your name? Second, how is it that something as simple as your data can be as valuable as oil? And third, the two sides of the coin, the positive side and the dark side of the use of your data. By dark, I don't just mean making you buy more stuff with good advertising, but literally changing the way you think. With these 3 points, we will be able to understand much of why Mark ended up being questioned. The number 1 point is how Facebook collects data about us, as it does so from everything you do within its platform, such as likes, comments, posts, friends you add, pages you visit, and even the time you spend viewing certain types of content. Even when you're not using Facebook directly, you can still track your activity if you visit websites or apps that have integrated platform tools, such as share buttons. And all that information becomes thousands of individual data points about you. To organize and connect all that information, Facebook uses a tool called a social graph. This graph is like a huge map that relates each user to their network of contacts, interests, behaviors, and links. Thanks to the social graph, the platform understands how people relate to each other and to the content they consume. Once Facebook has your data organized, its algorithm compares it with millions of other profiles and, from that analysis, deduces things about you that you may not even have directly expressed. From your political interests or your personality to whether you are going through a breakup, if you are thinking of moving, or if you might be expecting a baby. All of this is accomplished not only by what you say or do, but also by what the system infers by comparing you to similar patterns of behavior. This tool was essential to the launch of the newsfeed in 2006, as it allowed Facebook to decide which posts to show you, the predecessor to the modern algorithm based on your likes. So it's not that Facebook only collects data, it also connects them, interprets them, and builds a psychological and social profile of each person with a level of detail that many times not even that person has of themselves. That's why more than one of us has had it happen to us that we believe that our phone directly reads our thoughts. What happens is that it can predict our behaviors and that advertising suggestions are almost millimetric, the holy grail of brands that want you to see their ads. Precisely, this brings us to point 2. Why is your data so valuable? Superficially, we could say that it is for advertising. Through your data, they can build such an accurate map of you that the goal has become to serve people ultra-specialized advertising. And, well, superficially, we could think that this is not so bad if we put it on a scale. The fact that companies or social networks keep some of our data doesn't sound so bad if we compare it to the hours of entertainment they offer us, right? But this is when things get complicated. A company called Cambridge Analytica appears, which defined itself as a behavior modification agency and achieved it with a simple formula: behavioral psychology plus big data plus targeted engagement. The result: changing people's behavior. It may sound complicated, but I'll explain it with an example. The election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, where Cambridge Analytica played a key role. It all started with a researcher named Alexander Kogan, who created a program called This Is Your Digital Life. It was presented as an interesting personality test, something similar to those quizzes that became fashionable, like answer these 10 questions to find out what flavor of ice cream you are, but with a slightly more serious approach. Approximately 270,000 people took the test and authorized the app to access their location, likes, etc., and also their friends' data, but without their knowledge or consent. That's where a loophole in Facebook's privacy policies was found and exploited. Due to Facebook's policy at the time and a security bug, that app was able to collect data from up to 50 million users, and then Kogan sold that data to Cambridge Analytica, which violated Facebook's policies. But Cambridge Analytica didn't care either and used this data from 50 million people, plus other data it had already collected from previous U.S. presidential campaigns, to begin executing its plan to have Donald Trump win the election. From all these massive databases, Cambridge Analytica built a model that mined data points to predict the personality of every adult in America. And since personality influences behavior, the cycle repeated itself. Based on this personality, they were able to target highly personalized digital content to specific groups. While it had data on millions of voters, it didn't target everyone equally. Their main target was the so-called persuadables, i.e. people who were still undecided on who to vote for and could therefore be influenced. There were all over the country, but the most important ones were in key swing states such as Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Florida. Each state was divided into districts, and they would identify, for example, 22,000 swing voters in a single district. If they managed to swing enough voters in the right districts, the entire state could swing toward the Republicans, i.e. Trump. How did they do it? The team designed specific content for each person. The person in question received videos, blogs, articles, websites, and ads on every platform imaginable. Everything was tailor-made. They knew what kind of person you were, how you thought, what you cared about, and therefore what message you needed to convince you to vote for Trump. For example, if you were a single mother worried about your children's safety, you might receive alarming announcements about violence in nearby neighborhoods and Trump's promises of an iron fist. On the other hand, if you were an unemployed white youth, you saw videos about immigrants stealing jobs. Everyone was shown the message that was most likely to affect them emotionally. And since no one else saw what you saw, no one could question or contrast it, but this was not an isolated piece of content. They literally bombarded you with hundreds of posts to shape user opinion. In the company's own words, it's like a boomerang. You send us your data, we process it and send it back to you in the form of a personalized message to change your behavior. And that's how Donald Trump won the election of 2016 by a minimal margin, but he won. And I emphasize minimal because it may be that, without all this campaigning, that minimal would not have happened. If you think it was a matter of luck, it probably wasn't. Cambridge Analytica reported dozens of similar successful campaigns in other countries. One of the most obvious cases was on the island of Trinidad, where there are two main parties, one appealing to Afro-Caribbean voters. Cambridge worked for the Indian Party with a rather peculiar strategy, to get people not to vote. They focused on young people and, knowing their nature, launched an apolitical campaign that promoted apathy as a form of rebellion. They knew that many were not interested in politics, so they created an apolitical movement with the slogan "Do It," which actually meant, don't do anything, i.e., don't vote. The campaign took advantage of cultural differences in family dynamics and, thanks to that, the Indian candidate won by a slight amount of votes, but did so thanks to good thinking, data analysis, and segmented content. So yes, it can be argued that the mastermind behind many of these elections was not Facebook, but Cambridge Analytica, but none of this would have been possible if Facebook had had a good data protection system. Because of this scandal, Mark will have to show his face in front of the U.S. government, as he has been subpoenaed to testify in front of Congress, making it one of the most watched hearings in history. Mark tends to sweat and get very nervous in interviews, but this time that can't happen to him. That's why he prepared with his lawyers by rehearsing the toughest questions and the harshest accusations. Mark is calm and dry, gives perfect answers to almost every question, and, If he apologizes, it's the first thing he does. He accepts his mistakes and his responsibility as the leader of one of the most important companies in modern society. But Mark's goal here is to convince senators that the culprit behind it all is Alexander Kogan, the researcher who sold the data to Cambridge Analytica, and to avoid at all costs the government imposing any laws that might affect his status quo. That's why Mark defends the practice of saving data and tracking user activity as another way in which Facebook strives to fulfill that all-important mission of connecting the world. But Senator Dick Durbin asks Mark a few questions. Zuckerberg, would you tell us the hotel you stayed at last night? Would you tell us the names of the last 10 people you've talked to by message, in front of perhaps billions of people around the world, in addition to those physically present? Mark replies the obvious, no. The hearing itself is not a disaster for Mark. Most of the questions are very easy to answer or dodge, as many senators show ignorance regarding the facts, the workings of Facebook, and, in general, the tech industry. After the Cambridge Analytica scandal, Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook's image was scarred. Many began to hate them, as if they were a soulless company willing to sell your information to the highest bidder in order to make money. But watching the videos of the Senate hearing, I noticed something a bit peculiar. Most of the legislators didn't even know what to ask. They were asking basic, technical questions, misunderstandings, and, in many cases, they didn't even seem to understand how a company like Facebook makes money. And what I noticed is that scene seemed to me to be a kind of metaphor in which Mark represented the fast and relentless world of technology, and the senators represented the slow laws that were trying to regulate an environment that had already gotten out of hand. And I want to clarify that the only really illegal thing Cambridge Analytica did was violate Facebook's data protection rules by using information obtained without users' consent. But beyond that, everything they did with that data afterwards, segmenting, profiling, and influencing, was completely legal. Likewise, Facebook did not sell information, but it did make the mistake of having flaws in its security. However, collecting and selling that data is not illegal either, as long as you have agreed to the rules and policies that no one ever reads. With that in mind, it doesn't seem to me that Mark or Cambridge Analytica are the problem, as they simply did what any company would do under the logic of capital: maximize profits. And, as laws take a long time to understand new issues and react, these loopholes are created where companies take full advantage, and they will always do so as long as there is no law to prevent or regulate it. It's like the factories that for years dumped toxic waste into rivers, because it was cheaper to treat it properly. They knew it was wrong, but they also knew it was not illegal. And, as long as there were no environmental laws, the most profitable would always tend to win. It's the same with technology companies. If there are no laws to regulate them, they will do what is most profitable. Not necessarily because of evil, but because the logic of capital is not necessarily based on ethics but on profitability. And in this sense, it seems to me that the problem is perhaps not the player but the rules of the game. Now, even if it was legal, the moral debate is still there, because the Cambridge Analytica case becomes much more complex. Did they really psychologically manipulate millions of voters, or did they simply make a more efficient campaign with the tools they had at hand? Some think it was manipulation because emotions, fears, and prejudices were played with, and because many people never realized they were being influenced. Others believe it was not. No one took away their right to vote freely. In the end, each person stood in front of the ballot box and made their choice. And one thing I can't get away from is that, after this whole Senate thing, Mark's suspicions that he was some kind of weird entity trying to make the world think he was human intensified. And while many took it as a joke, there were those who really started to get suspicious. They suspected that something strange was going on with him, even more so if they compared him to other media CEOs like Elon Musk or Steve Jobs. In Mark's case, his body language, his rehearsed answers, and the difficulty in interpreting certain dynamics made many people think that there was something very dark about him, as if he were an alien, a robot, or some other kind of creature. However, I think there is a more human and possible explanation. Mark Zuckerberg could be on the high-functioning autism spectrum. There is no official confirmation, beyond that of some colleagues who worked with him. Some traits they present are his difficulty in expressing spontaneous emotions, his tense body posture, and his extremely controlled way of speaking. His social awkwardness in public contexts and his systematic and logical thinking coincide with what is usually observed in people within the autistic spectrum. Added to that, as a child, he was considered a brilliant programmer and had a certain degree of obsession with things he liked, to the point of spending weeks at a time immersed in projects. Not everyone with outstanding intelligence and a great ability to concentrate is necessarily on the autism spectrum. There are many reasons why someone may exhibit these traits without implying a neurological condition, but when many of these elements combine, then it may be reasonable to raise the possibility. I insist this is not a diagnosis but a hypothesis that, if true, could help us better understand not only how he acts, but also why he is sometimes perceived as so alien to the traditional image we have of a charismatic leader. But, while all this was going on, Facebook bought Instagram for $1 billion and WhatsApp for $19 billion and also takes Facebook's company public. When this happens, Facebook's value increases overnight to $104 billion. With this, Mark feels more at ease when it comes to paying for a wedding. So, the next day, Mark marries Priscilla Chan, his Harvard-era girlfriend. In addition, she becomes a much more media-conscious person. But, no matter how much media she is, and no matter how much she tries to behave as calmly as possible during the hearings, the Cambridge Analytica scandal wreaks havoc and irreparably erodes public confidence in the company and in Mark, no matter how many apologies and interviews he makes advocating his innocence. The consequence that hurts the company the most, though not necessarily Mark, is that it becomes the first in history to lose $100 million in one day. On a personal level, Mark did not live like a wealthy person in 2008, when he was on the list of the richest people in the world, as he shared a one-bedroom apartment with his then-girlfriend and slept on the floor. Now the situation is very different. He lives in a mansion built on 400 acres he bought on an island in Hawaii, has 3 daughters, a dog named Bestia, and one of the best-rated companies in the world, although it needs a small adjustment. Changing the name of the company to Meta. It is, in his own words, a company that develops technology rooted in the human connection that brings people together. That's why it is buying Oculus VR, now called Reality Labs, for $2 billion. This is a company dedicated to creating virtual and augmented reality devices. Then he creates the metaverse, which doesn't turn out so well, and later he creates Meta and Ray-Ban glasses, which integrate your vision with a camera and an artificial intelligence assistant called Llama. Mark Zuckerberg is certainly one of those few men who really changed the world. I'm not saying for better or worse, but there is undoubtedly a before and after Facebook in the history of social networks and the way we relate to each other. Its creation transformed the way we communicate and changed social, political, and cultural dynamics on a global scale. Perhaps it has made mistakes with its algorithms, with business decisions, with data management, with the very design of the platform. I will be naive if I deny it, but there is also something important we must understand. Facebook was the first in many ways. There was no other company leading the way. There was no manual. They were the way, and as with any pioneer, they have had to move forward as well. It meant getting it wrong. I don't say this to exculpate Meta of their responsibilities, not at all, but I do mention it to try to empathize a bit with the good Mark. And, if you're wondering why he did it, why he does everything he does, I found an interview that explains it a bit. The interviewer tells Mark that they are obsessed with something or care too much about something specific, for example, Steve Jobs, who we could say was very concerned about the aesthetics of things. The interviewer then asks Mark, what is it that he cares a lot about? And Mark replies, I care about connecting everyone. He continues, I believe that communities, when they are well connected, can channel their energy into doing great things. Connections between people are the infrastructure that allows that to happen. And so, even though there was a lot of uncertainty about whether what we were doing would be profitable, whether it would make sense, whether it would be a good thing or not, we did it anyway because we cared so much. And finally, a little reminder. As poetic as Mark makes it sound, the truth is that social networks do connect us, but they don't necessarily bring us together. We are still human beings with brains that haven't changed that much since we lived in caves. We are deeply social, and while chatting via text messages, etc., keeping up a streak on TikTok with your girlfriends or making calls while playing League of Legends may feel like closeness, but it doesn't seem to replace real human contact. Of course, social networks also have a constructive side. They allow us to see our parents when they are far away, to keep in touch with friends who no longer live in our city, and to open conversations we might not have dared to have in person. But even so, nothing replaces being present with each other body and soul.